In making the case for the LCMS, I could channel Garrison Keillor and talk about Lake Wobegon and Pastor Inkvist's problems and the Picayunist troubles between the Missouri Synod and the other Lutherans. It would all be delightful. I could talk about potlucks and the smells wafting out of church basements on a Sunday morning.
Pastor Matt Harrison speaking at this year's Issues Etc. Making the Case conference.
But finally, that would all just fade away like so much pleasant aroma in the wind. Without Christ, without this public confession of Christ, it would all be for naught, all of it.
You can watch Pastor Matt Harrison's presentation, Making the Case for the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, from our 2026 Making the Case conference. For a contribution of $250 by Labor Day, we'll send you a link to conference video and audio recordings. Order online at issuesetc.org.
Pro-life incumbents have done very well since Dobbs. Not one pro-life incumbent has lost a statewide race.
Margaret Thatcher very famously said, socialism works great until you run out of other people's money. In the Islamic system, the system works great until you run out of the infidels' money.
I love this quotation from Luther. He says, "Spare me from a church in which there are no sinners." The essential character of being a Christian is to be a redeemed sinner.
If we are Christians and we suffer, is that so unbelievable that we should bear a splinter of Jesus' cross after he has gone through so much as a perfect one?
Hospice nurses driving around from patient to patient love listening to Issues Etc.
Everyone agrees that we are living in a post-Christian age. We may not agree about what that really means, but we do agree that we have crossed a threshold, perhaps a point of no return. But that's where the disagreements begin. In a post-Christian age, should we be forming our pastors more intensely or less intensely? Should we be spending more time with them as we prepare them to be pastors, or less? Greetings and welcome to Issues Etc., coming to you live from the studios of Lutheran Public Radio in Collinsville, Illinois. I'm Todd Wilkin. Thanks for tuning us in. We'll be concluding our series on a life lived on the road to Emmaus. Dr. Arthur Just will be our guest. Dr. Andrew Steinman joins us after that to remember Old Testament matriarch Ruth on this day. Then Pastor David Haberstock is president-elect of the Lutheran Church Canada. We'll discuss confessional Lutheranism in that country. Dr. Arthur Just is professor of New Testament at Concordia Theological Seminary, Fort Wayne, Indiana, seasonal pastor at Grace Lutheran Church in Naples, Florida, author of several books, including his latest, Ever to Emmaus, a Theological Memoir. Dr. Just, welcome back.
Good to be back with you, Todd, and I so much appreciate you spending the time on this memoir.
We had mentioned briefly your involvement kind of on the ground floor in deaconess formation. How did that come about?
Well, one of the things that happened really when I first got to the seminary in 1984 was that we were in discussions about deacons and deaconesses. Dr. Preuss, Robert Preuss, was very, very interested when he became president of the seminary to sort of fulfill Wilhelm Leah, one of the founders of our seminary, his desire to start a program of deaconess studies in the United States. And, we'd had serious conversations about that. And we thought, wow, this is something that would be a great thing to happen. But you know how life gets in the way and other things take over. And nothing really happened until Dean Wenthe and Bill Weinrich became the leaders of our seminary. And they were part of that conversation in the 80s. And in 1996, this became something that we wanted to do. We were in the middle of an accreditation, though, and we didn't want to start a new program. So we waited a little bit, probably longer than we wanted to. But St. Louis responded to the synods. I think it was 2001. I'm not clear always on the synod's dates, but in convention, they allowed the seminaries to train women for deaconess service. It was a master's. Concordia University in Chicago had a bachelor's in deaconess studies, and we were going to have a master's. And St. Louis started the year before us, but Dean and Bill thought that because I had started the accreditation program at Fort Wayne and I had run the graduate school and that I had an interest in Luke and possessions in Luke's gospel and knew a little bit about diaconia, that in I guess it was the spring of 2003 they asked me to get this program started, and that's when we began our program. And it was like any program, it started and stopped for a year or so, but then all of a sudden it just took off, and we had what we call an all-star class of deaconesses, many of whom are still very vital in the church's life. And we just, really took off from there. One of the things that was really helpful was that Matt Harrison was very desirous, as he worked for World Relief Human Care, for the seminaries to get involved in this work. And he was very supportive of us, and he helped us not just with moral support, but financially as well. And one of the things he did for me, and I had no clue about this, but he asked me in 2005 to begin to think about traveling to Kenya because they had a very vital deaconess program there, and they understood what it meant to be women of mercy. So I started going in 2005 for about almost 10 years. Every summer we went, and boy, did they teach us about mercy. I've never seen anything like it in these women who really had very little. And yet when they visited, this is where this whole notion of visitation and the homebound, I mean, we all do it as pastors, but they take it to a new level. They never went empty-handed, even though they didn't have much for themselves. They always carried a big jar of oil and some maize to make ugali, which is one of the staples. Sometimes they'd bring a chicken. And, we would go on visitations with them, and we found all kinds of issues, spiritual issues, and I would do devotions with them. And that, was something that was a bit eye-opening for them. They were praying with them and doing other things, but they didn't have the kind of formal thing that I was doing. And that ended up in a book, with Scott Kinnaman called Visitation. And so it was really an important part of our seminary's life. I learned a lot about mercy and diaconia, developed all kind of a theology of mercy and teaching those courses. We were initially interested in addressing human care needs. That was the language we used, because we wanted our deaconesses not to be women who were trained theologically, but who were sort of the experts in their congregations on the kind of the social amenities that our country provided and the churches provided and other agencies, and to help the people in their congregation negotiate those, as well as hospitals. We wanted to have nurses involved, and we wanted them to actually have a nursing degree, but no nursing degree will let you just take a few courses. So that was out of the question. But we went for parish nurses, and it wasn't as successful as I thought, but we did get a couple because they were a natural fit. And that led us to an MA in Deaconess Studies that was a hybrid course, where they would come on campus a couple times a year, but the courses were online. And these had to be older women who were, I think, over 35 or something. I don't remember the age limit. But we were thinking of all these women in our congregations who, are basically deaconesses. They're doing diaconal work in their congregation, but they don't have a theological degree. And here we could help them get an MA in theology and actually give them an office of deaconess. And so that took off. That may be the most successful thing we did. And I think they were perfect for online studies because they were experienced. They had lots to share. They weren't afraid to share. They were hardworking. Some of our best students. That was really, in many ways, one of the most significant parts of my life at the seminary. I didn't do it that long, from 2003 to 2011, and then I gave it over to Jim Busher, who was just an extraordinary replacement. I mean, he took it to a new level. And now, we have Susan Knowles, who's taken over for him after he was there much longer than I was. But it was definitely a thing that was kind of crucial to our identity. One of the most interesting things when I started is I was the dean of the chapel. So I was in charge of the liturgical life of the church. So I would always talk about the relationship between liturgia and diaconia. And the way I talked about it is, in the Kramer Chapel is where we receive the gifts, through the liturgy of the divine service. And God is the giver of the gifts, and we receive them. And then when we go out from the church, we engage in what I called the liturgy of life, where we embodied the Christ who is in us that we received in the liturgy. We embody him in the world through our acts of love and mercy and compassion. We're Christ's in the world. And so there is, in a sense, a real presence of Christ in us in the world, which is why I called it the liturgy of life.
How do you continue to respond to those who express concerns about the deaconess program being some kind of a precursor to the ordination of women?
Well, I think it's just the opposite, actually, because, certainly, one of the things we found right away, and our faculty certainly understood this, is that our women understood the office of the ministry much, much better than the men did. And they had no desire to be pastors. In fact, that was one of the game changers for me when I began the program, because one of the things that I discovered in talking to deaconesses is that they were defined by what they were not. They were not able to preach. They were not able to celebrate the sacraments. They were not involved in the sacramental life of the church. And that's true, but it's hard to define an identity by not. So that's where we switched it and said, these are the women of mercy who stand along the side of the pastor and bring people to the doors of the church and point them to the pastor where they receive the gifts from him. One of the things I did at Matt Harrison's encouragement was went around the world, frankly. And these were places that were considering women's ordination. And I was providing an alternative. I was providing something that would be a way for women to serve. And I think that's one of the issues in a church like ours that doesn't have women's ordination. How do women serve? Now, we do have the other auxiliary offices, the directors of evangelism and directors of Christian education, etc. But this was a way for women to serve. And one of the ways I pictured it, and not everybody was always happy with this, but I think it works, is that the Missouri Synod has a very male face. We don't have women's ordination, so all they see is the male face of a pastor. And if the church is like a family, it needs to have the two faces, the masculine and the feminine face. And it needs, so to speak, a mother. And in a way, this is one of the ways in which I talked about the deaconess program. We don't need more fathers, so to speak, but we do need mothers. We need people to take care of the sick and the suffering. And when I was a pastor, this is what I recognized. I loved all the pastoral stuff, preaching, teaching, celebrating the Lord's Supper. And I did love the visitations, but boy, that was time consuming. And the counseling, where I could really use help, was somebody who could walk alongside me in working with people who are, in a sense, what Wilhelm Leah called the extraordinary means of pastoral care. And that was something that I think a lot of pastors who, when they began to think about deaconesses, they resonated to that. Boy, it would be helpful to have somebody serve, with me in the kind of that time-consuming part of the ministry. And that would include education, the youth, children, older people. That's the great thing about deaconesses, that there are so many ways in which they can serve. They can serve in nursing facilities, hospices, prisons. They can serve in schools. We wanted to develop a leadership where they could be leaders in some of these places, and there are some who have. But I think that that's a kind of a specious argument if you understand what we're teaching about deaconesses and how they fully and completely understand their role as one who works alongside of the pastor and points people to the pastor, but is not the pastor.
Dr. Arthur Just is our guest. We're concluding our series with him on a life lived on the road to Emmaus. We'll discuss his time in the mission field next.
This week on The Word of the Lord Endures Forever, we continue our walk through the Psalter, considering Psalms 128 through 132. Thus shall the man be blessed. They made long their furrows. With you there is forgiveness, like a weaned child, and arise, O Lord. Join me, Pastor Will Whedon, for The Word of the Lord Endures Forever, your daily 15-minute verse-by-verse Bible study on demand. Listen at thewordendures.org or your favorite podcast provider.
What can we learn about the worship practices of the first Lutherans from a Reformation edict by a Calvinist leader? Find out in Will Whedon's column in the latest Issues Etc. journal. We'll send it to you for free. Just click the red journal subscription button at issuesetc.org and enter your email address. In the Wittenberg Trail feature, Pastor Michael Hughes writes about his journey from progressive Lutheranism to confessional Lutheranism. The Issues Etc. journal. Subscribe for free at issuesetc.org.
Equipping the priesthood of all believers. You're listening to Issues Etc.
Holy Cross Evangelical Lutheran Church, Albany, Oregon, is a mid-Willamette Valley LCMS congregation where the liturgy lives and God's people worship as one, with sound biblical doctrine, weekly communion, and a clear confession of Christ crucified for the sin of the world. Please join us at 2515 Queen Avenue Southeast, or visit our website at www.holycrosslutheranalbany.org.
At the heart of Lutherans for Life is good news. Good news that brings hope to a culture so focused on death. Lutherans for Life equips Lutherans and their neighbors to be gospel-motivated voices for life. Lutherans for Life believes God gives the gift of life to all people, from the moment of conception until natural death. Learn more about how you and your congregation can help bring hope and healing to all the life issues through a wide variety of resources and caring activities at lutheransforlife.org.
Welcome back to Issues Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. Dr. Arthur Just is our guest. He's professor of New Testament at Concordia Theological Seminary, Fort Wayne, Indiana. Dr. Just, we've discussed it several times in passing here in our conversations, but talk about your time in what we'll call the foreign mission field, and tell us where that has taken you.
Well, in 1996 is when I really got involved in this, when we had what we called the Macedonian call from the Siberian Lutheran Church to help them start a seminary there. And Bill Weinrich, Tim Quill, and I went there the first year, and we did these summer seminars. We also went to Kazakhstan, but we were in Siberia and recruiting people and helping them put together curriculum, basically a seminary. And, we did that for about 10 years. And as I was doing that, what I began to realize, and this is when we were developing a new curriculum at our seminary, I kind of became a curriculum expert. And then with the deaconess studies and having developed a deaconess curriculum, I really was involved in kind of formal theological education for those who were partner churches and people who were seeking to either begin or to kind of enliven and deepen their seminary lives. The real game changer for me was going to Spain in 2002. Now, from the day I was a seminary student, I wanted to be a missionary in Spain. We lived in Spain from 74 to 78. Franco died during those years. It was illegal to be a Protestant. There were no Lutheran churches. We worshiped with the Anglicans in a cemetery with guards because it was illegal for us to meet. The Anglican bishop would come over every month and he would do confirming and preaching and communing the Anglicans. And that's where we worshiped. And so I knew Spain was going to be ripe for that when it opened up in 76, I think it was. Franco died then, and they sort of became a democracy. And I wanted to do that when I was at the seminary, and I did it later on when I was a parish pastor in Connecticut, and even as a pastor in Middletown and as a seminary professor. I had the call to Mexico City a couple of times, which I turned down because I was involved either in the parish or at the SEM. But in 2002, Doug Rutt found a way for me to go there about a little over a year after the mission started, and I was to help transition the Argentinian missionaries. And it turned out I ended up being the missionary for about 3 months and orienting the new missionary to the work in Spain. And then I went back 10 years later and helped again, and it had developed quite a bit. And at that point, Ted Cray, and that's a long story, I talk about it in the book, but Ted Cray is the one who discovered me, so to speak, when we were together in Haiti. He didn't know my history in Spain. And from that moment on, I was sort of his informal liaison for the Missouri Synod to Spain. But then in 2015, they wanted to kind of formalize it, half time in Spain and half time in the United States. And so I did that. And then I got involved in the DR seminary, helping to start that. And it's at that point where they asked me to be on the executive committee. This was Dan McMiller, to be involved with Latin America and the Caribbean. And then during COVID, he switched my responsibilities to global theological education. And so I was involved in consulting in Latin America and Africa, starting a seminary in the DR, helping with the Livonian Project in Eurasia. They wanted a seminary in Taiwan, so I did all the groundwork for that, did some teaching. And so I got very much involved in what I believe, and I think this is one of the game changers since Matt Harrison has been president of our synod, that theology in the mission field has to be involved with pastors and planting congregations, with works of mercy. This is how we tell people about Jesus. And it's really all about seminaries and pastors and deaconesses and the theological education in our theological schools that provide pastors throughout the world. One of the sadnesses during the time before President Harrison was that they dismantled it. For example, in Latin America, a lot of the seminaries, there was only one, Argentina, and starting the one in the DR gave us a second one, which really was a huge blessing. Even the one in Mexico City had kind of either dissolved a little bit or had been taken over by other Lutherans. So I found being involved in theological education globally is one of the most satisfying things I've ever done. And you can just see how important that is to the mission of the church. And here's how I put it: planning Lutheran churches by forming Lutheran pastors, and planning deaconess programs by bringing deaconesses to places where they can learn what it means to be a deaconess. And you can see that in Latin America. It's just been huge. So it's been a great, wonderful gift.
I'd like you to speak with that as kind of the base of your extensive experience in pastoral formation, both in the U.S. and elsewhere. Why, contrary to how things were done, as you said, in the previous administrations, where pastoral formation was really divorced from mission work, and planting altars, pulpits, and fonts was divorced from mission work, why it's so vital that we first form those pastors and then plant those altars, pulpits, and fonts there in the field.
Well, it goes back to what we spoke about in the very, I think, first session we had together on Ever to Emmaus, and that is that it's all about the bodily presence of Christ. I mean, the way the church is formed, the way people are formed, is by being in the presence of Jesus. And that is the place where we receive what we need from him, the gifts, the gifts of forgiveness, life, and salvation. And that has always been the way from the very beginning. I'm teaching this thing on Acts next week, and I mean, you can see it all through the book of Acts, of the formation of pastors, the leaders of the church, and how the proclamation of the gospel by people who have been, called and ordained. This is how people receive Christ. Now, it's not to say that volunteers who are lay people or who are in other non-ordained categories can't witness or speak or bring people to Jesus. But at the end of the day, they have to be in a place where the community is gathered, where the body of Christ is present, where the word of God is preached and read, and where they receive the body and blood of Christ in the sacrament. When I teach early church liturgical history, I talk about the house churches and how they were always word and sacrament churches. There was never a church that was just a group getting together to study the Bible. They were always word and sacrament churches. They were always baptized there, who were receiving the gifts, and the catechumens joined that community and were catechized, baptized, and then were invited to receive Christ in the Lord's Supper. So this is the rhythm of our life. And I think we can see in both the loss of this in the mission of the church, in our Lutheran church, and the loss of our understanding of the liturgy go hand in hand. I mean, if you just don't value the liturgy as you should, if the means of grace in the liturgy, word and sacrament, are not central to the life of the church, then the mission is going to go in a different direction. I remember getting into real trouble when I first came to the seminary, when I talked about that the Great Commission, which I don't really call it that. I think it's Matthew 28 is it's a church order. It's how you do church. And I wrote about that both in the Memoir and in other places too. But what is the essence of the church? It's not the Great Commission. It's the liturgy of the church. It's where Christ is present. And the Great Commission brings people to that. But, I always tell people, in heaven, there's going to be no Great Commission. It's just going to be one huge liturgy with Father, Son, and Holy Spirit at the throne of the Lamb, And this is what we do here in anticipation of there. And I love what Luther says about this. He talks about, when he's talking about the liturgy, faith and love. Faith receives the gifts. And then love is our response to the gifts. First, love to God in the liturgy, and love to our neighbor, the two tables of the law in the liturgy. But then there's the love for the neighbor who knows not Christ. And that's where the Great Commission comes. It comes out of the liturgy. So the greatest thing we can do, the greatest, I should say, act of love we can do for our neighbor who knows not Christ, is to tell him about Jesus and then bring him into the presence of Jesus so they can receive the gifts of forgiveness, life, and salvation from that bodily presence of Christ in word and sacrament. And so I think, when we talk about the worship wars, there really were mission wars too, and they went hand in hand. And as soon as you kind of lose that sense of what the church is, then you're going to lose a lot of other things as well. And this is why the liturgy is so important. People who do not understand it are going to have a hard time understanding all other aspects of the church's life.
Dr. Arthur Just is our guest. We're concluding our series with him on a life lived on the road to Emmaus. We'll talk about preparing pastors in a post-Christian world next. What do Jesus and Paul teach about marriage, divorce, unchastity, and desertion? The Issues Etc. book of the month for July is Divorce and Remarriage, Ecclesiastical Discernment and Pastoral Care. This new resource is published by Concordia Publishing House. Their phone number, 1-800-325-3040. You can learn more about divorce and remarriage at issuesetc.org. Divorce and Remarriage by Dr. Ben Mays, the Issues Etc. book of the month for July.
Deaconesses are women trained to share the gospel of Jesus Christ through works of mercy, spiritual care, and teaching of the Christian faith. The word deaconess means servant. Find out more on how you can serve in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod through the vocation of deaconess at lcms.org/deaconess. Working in faith, laboring in love, remaining steadfast in the hope of our Lord Jesus Christ. LCMS Deaconess Ministry. lcms.org/deaconess.
Casting Christ's net on the internet. You're listening to Issues Etc.
Well, the vocation of pastor, I would say, is a vocation that will bring you the greatest joy ever. That the Lord would use you to speak forth words of eternal life to His people. That He would use your mouth and your hands to deliver these gifts to His people.
Dr. Carl Beckwith, Professor of Historical Theology at Concordia Theological Seminary, Fort Wayne, Indiana.
I think in my mind there's no better place to be than Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and all should rejoice in the opportunity to come here to study for the ministry.
Concordia Theological Seminary, Fort Wayne, Indiana, forms servants in Jesus Christ who teach the faithful, reach the lost, and care for all. For information on studying for the vocation of pastor, visit ctsfw.edu or call 1-800-481-2155. Concordia Theological Seminary, Fort Wayne, Indiana. Welcome back to Issues, Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. We're talking with Dr. Arthur Just about a life lived on the road to Emmaus. Dr. Just, it is sadly said among us nowadays that we live in a post-Christian world, and therefore it's created kind of an emergency situation for the formation of pastors. They need less training, faster training, not the kind of training that you have been doing for more than 4 decades, and that is residential seminary training both here and abroad. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's, something that I've experienced for the whole 42 years I've been at the seminary. I mean, people have wanted to form pastors apart from our 2 Lutheran seminaries in St. Louis and Fort Wayne. And I do think, Todd, and I'm careful to say this, but I think one of the reasons why this has happened is that they just don't like the theology that is coming out of the seminaries. They want a different theology. They want to be in control of that theology. Confessional Lutheran theology, deeply biblical theology, liturgical theology, being shaped by Kramer Chapel and St. Timothy and St. Titus Chapel in St. Louis is not a priority for them. Again, it kind of goes back to that. I mean, if you don't have residential education, you don't have Christ forming students in the chapels by daily worship and having the Eucharist there where they come and receive within the community and learn about the relationship between what we call Jerusalem, which is the chapel, and Athens, the classroom. That conversation back and forth. I mean, that's why the chapel is the most important building in our seminary and why it's the highest point and why we value it so much. It is the heart of our life. It's the heart of our curriculum. It's the heart of everything we do. Now, you're not going to get that in non-residential or shortened, types of pastoral formation. And, theological education is not easy. It takes time. I'm still learning all the time. When you see the students who learn Greek and Hebrew and their eyes just pop open when they see how this reveals to them things that they could not know outside of studying these texts in the original languages, it's mind-boggling. And I think one of the things that I always like to talk about, and people use this all the time, but it happens to be true. I mean, I don't want an online educated surgeon. When I'm going in for surgery, I want somebody who spent all that time, was in residential care, had all those residencies, who has really put in the time. And, I mean, the heart, we're, in a sense, we're surgeons of the heart. We're people who are forming people, and it can go so bad if you don't have the proper formation in theology. And so I think they're selling our people short by wanting this. And there is certainly, and I'll say this carefully, a healthy desire for reaching out to others with the mission of the church. And maybe we could do more of that at the seminaries. I mean, I'm certainly willing to admit that. But boy, what I just said about what we've been doing in theological missions overseas, and I think our both seminaries are very much involved in, evangelizing people in this country, that I think, we can't put enough time in. The other thing I would say is this: the disciples spent 3 years with Jesus and they still didn't quite get it. And I mean, imagine that was intense theological formation. And I think many of our programs that are 3 years are built on the notion that Jesus used 3 years to form his 12 disciples. The early catechumenate, and I know this blows people's mind, was 3 years long. And I think, again, that was formed after the pattern of Jesus' ministry for 3 years with his disciples. And so I think, if it's good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for us. People will bring up examples of those who didn't have as much training, but most of them are really people who were of Jewish background and who knew the scriptures and didn't need the kind of formation from the start that Gentiles did. I always point this out. It's a very subtle thing. But Paul spent 1.5 years in Corinth among Gentiles because he knew he needed to have time there to catechize them properly and probably form the pastors there. And he spent 2 years in Ephesus or more, and those were Gentile communities. So I think you have biblical precedents here. I think you have the precedent of Jesus and the Gospels. And I just think that this sense of urgency, we've always had the sense of urgency. I mean, ever since Pentecost, there's been a sense of urgency, but there's also equally the sense of faithfulness and being fully involved in the scriptures. I mean, just think of Apollos. He was lecturing in Corinth, and he needed Aquila and a Priscilla to come and give him a better background. And he acknowledged that, and he became a better preacher as a result of that. I just think it's short-sightedness, and I think it's people who, going back to my first point, really are not happy with the theology that is coming out of the seminaries, and they just want to do something different.
I would simply add to that in a truly post-Christian era here in the West, and not to even mention places in the mission field where it's not merely post-Christian, it is in some places predominantly Islamic, I think the men who serve congregations need more formation than ever.
I think you're absolutely right. That's a hard argument to make because of the push the other way, but you should just talk to our students. I mean, the ones especially that have come out of programs that weren't residential and then came into the residential program, they will tell you that they are not prepared enough when they go out. They want more time. And some of them we have to push out the door. I know I kind of felt that way. I felt like, yeah, okay, I've just scratched the surface, which is why I went on for more study and for an STM and a PhD. But I think that in this day and age, because of the challenges we have, as you have indicated, we have to seriously think about even more theological education than we've been doing.
We began and have often revisited in the course of this conversation that account in Luke on the road to Emmaus. And you've said it several times already here today that Christians are made, they are formed, and they are kept in the faith by the presence of Jesus. Take us back to that account of Emmaus and expand upon that.
Well, the reason why it has been so formative for me and why I keep going back to it, why I'm ever to Emmaus, is because it has everything, and I think Lutherans should really resonate to this, everything that I've been involved with in my life and everything that really goes into being a faithful pastor in a church. The road to Emmaus is the first place where anyone recognizes Jesus as the crucified and risen Lord, a human being. And it happens through Jesus' teaching of the Old Testament, opening to them the scriptures, giving them this Christological blick, and I'd call it a sacramental blick, that the entire Old Testament is about him and that he is the object of it and that it speaks about his suffering and death in particular. You can see this in the sermons of Paul in Acts. I mean, again and again, he comes back to the fact that it's the suffering and resurrected Messiah that's at the heart of everything. And so there you have the teaching, you have the proclamation, you have the preaching, that which forms. But it only created burning hearts. I mean, they knew that something extraordinary was happening. They knew that nobody had ever interpreted or given them the hermeneutical key, the key of interpretation, the key of knowledge, as Luke says in chapter 11, verse 51. The key of knowledge that unlocks the Old Testament. But then there is more. There is more. I mean, there is the sitting down at the table, the taking it, the bread, breaking it, blessing it, and and giving it to them. And it is in the breaking of the bread that the eyes are opened. That's sort of the culmination of the whole process. And they go together. Word prepares the ground, the soil, so to speak. It gets the people ready for the seed to be planted. And it's the breaking of the bread. It's the Lord's Supper, where we commune with the very body and blood of Christ, that intimate knowledge, that knowing. That really is what opens the eyes. And they go together. And those have always been the two great liturgical structures of the liturgy. They've always been the ways in which we have, in a sense, not just delivered the goods to the baptized, but the way through, especially through the word service, which was called the Liturgy of the Catechumens, where we prepared people for baptism so that they might be ready to receive the Lord's Supper. And so Emmaus just endures. And it's such a great story. It's a resurrection story. It shows you how important the resurrection is. There is no mission without the resurrection. You can see that the book of Acts is about the resurrection. The impetus for mission is the resurrection. That's why we come to church, is because of our belief in the resurrection. And it's the resurrected Christ who is the teacher on the road, and he's the one who is presiding over the breaking of the bread. And so that last line in the Emmaus story, how they explain to them the things on the road, which was the teaching on the road, and how he was made known to them in the breaking of the bread. Those are the two main ways in which the bodily presence of Christ comes to us. And so that's why my doctoral father, John McHugh, said to me when we started in earnest to just write on the Emmaus story way back in the 1980s, he said, Arthur, this is a passage that you will have as the center of your theology for the rest of your life, because it is the heart of everything that we do as pastors and everything that the church is all about.
We will talk more about the Emmaus account in Luke's Gospel as we conclude our series on a life lived on the road to Emmaus with Dr. Arthur Just.
We're in the battle, but the sound of the Lord's victory is echoing from heaven and from the new heaven and the new earth, and we can hear the sound. It's faintly, but it's drawing us to itself. That glory is almost here, that life is almost here, that the new heaven and the new earth are almost here.
Pastor Brian Wolf-Miller speaking at the 2026 Issues Etc. Making the Case Conference.
And when the fight is fierce and the warfare long, steals on the ear that distant triumph song, and then hearts are brave and arms are strong.
For a contribution of $250 by Labor Day, we'll send you a link to watch an on-demand video stream and download audio recordings of all this year's conference, including Pastor Wolf-Miller's teaching on Christian courage. Learn more at issuesetc.org or call 618-223-8385.
Continuing education for the Confessional Lutheran. You're listening to Issues Etc.
Unity and variety can be a hot topic among Christians and Lutherans in particular, and the June-July issue of the Lutheran Witness takes this topic up with articles such as Unity and Variety Through the Ages by Richard Serena, Formed Together by Sean Dinzer, A Call to Faithful and Harmonious Variety in Worship, and much more. To get your copy, visit cph.org/witness or visit witness.lcms.org to learn more. The Lutheran Witness, helping you interpret the world from a Lutheran perspective.
Issues Etc. listeners are invited to attend Lutherans for Life's Fall Gala Friday evening, September the 18th in Des Moines, Iowa. The gala will feature a fellowship hour, a ministry update, and a keynote address from Dr. James Lamb. Learn more at lutheransforlife.org, lutheransforlife.org. We're concluding our series on a life lived on the road to Emmaus with Dr. Arthur Just. Dr. Just, one of the things I find fascinating about the end of that Emmaus account is that the two disciples immediately returned to Jerusalem with the report of what they had seen, and they are no more finished telling what had happened, then there is Jesus bodily among them again.
Yeah, that is one of the great sort of conundrums about Luke 24. I mean, I talk about this all the time in class, that Luke is absolutely meticulous in the way in which he records time, especially in Luke 24. There are 5 time notices in the Emmaus account. And the last one is, it says, in that hour they returned to Jerusalem, as you said, and reported to the others about what they had experienced with Jesus. And there's that irony when the 11 say, hey, the Lord's appeared to Peter. And, you can just see the Emmaus disciples saying, wait until you hear what we have to tell you. And they do. But there are no time notices after that. Immediately you're in the probably the upper room, the 11 with Jesus, and he gives the greeting, peace to you, which is the greeting of the kingdom. He gave that back in Luke 10 when he sent out the 70. When you go from house to house, say peace to that house. And that's the first thing Jesus says to them. And then immediately he teaches them, and immediately it's ascension. There are no time notices. All those passages, one right after another, after another, after another. And, higher critics will tell you that Luke was confused when he wrote the gospel. He didn't know that, for example, the ascension came 40 days later, or that Jesus appeared to the 11 8 days later, and that he just all thought it's happened on Easter Day. And I think what they miss, and I think this is the point of Luke, is that once Jesus has opened up the scriptures, and once he has broken bread and their eyes are opened and they see him for who he is, the crucified and risen Christ, they have entered into the end times. And this is the blick. This is that inaugurated eschatology, that the Lamb who was slain, he now reigns, and there he is reigning. And so there's no reason there to record historical time, because we are in the end times. The end times have been brought forward in the Eternal One, who has now accomplished his work of death and resurrection, and that his presence there with them indicates that heaven is already here. And yeah, we're going to end up marking the time, but during the time that he's with us, we don't need to mark the time, because we're in eternity. The Eternal One is here, and he's giving us his gifts. He's sitting down at table with us. He ate and drank with us after he rose from the dead. Peter says to Cornelius in Acts 10. It's a beautiful passage. It's so important to see that the Eternal One doesn't have to mark time. And Luther understood this. This is the 8th day theology. And anybody interested in this, read what many, many years ago I wrote in the commentary in connection with the circumcision of John. And I cite Luther there. And I cite it all the time because it's always good to have Luther on your side. And boy, did he understand this, that there are no longer any counting of days, he says, because we are in the eternal day, the Sunday, and we're the eternal 8th day. And I think that's why, it looks like, we're right away going from Emmaus to Jesus coming, because there's no reason to mark the days after the breaking of the bread.
So with that said, and I completely agree with you, you've marked a lot of days in service of the church, and much, if not most of that time has been spent in the intense education and formation of the church's pastors. So seeing a lot of those guys come and go. What are your hopes for the future of pastoral formation in confessional Lutheranism?
Well, I think ever since Dean Wente became president and Bill Weinrich became the provost, or at that time the academic dean, we've been in a kind of golden age. And President Larry Rass continued it, and I think we're now continuing it with our new president, John Bruss. We have a great faculty. We get this, and we understand this. And I think with these challenges that we're getting for these alternate means of pastoral formation, I think we have to double down. And my hope is, like we've been saying, that we have to deepen the education. We have to convince the good people of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod that what we're doing at the seminaries is the most vital thing we do. And they've always recognized that. I mean, that's why they give to the seminary. That's why they're so generous to us. And I think they understand they need pastors, and they need theologically trained pastors. They need pastors who know what they're talking about and have experience, and that they get the liturgy and the mission of the church and how they're integrally related. My hope is that more and more, especially young men, and we've been seeing more of them coming, but just like my young men and old men, as it says in the Joel prophecy at Pentecost, we need all of them to come and recognize the vital ministry that we have. Now, I think the challenges coming up are significant. We say that in a way in every generation, but I do think with secularism and the rise of Islam and the fact that, fewer and fewer people are claiming to be Christians, that we have just an extraordinary challenge and opportunity. And I think we need people, and this is my hope, that people that are really ready, to be on the front lines in the apocalyptic battle and to be foot soldiers there to take on Satan and all the evil forces that are out there trying to undermine what Christ has done and what the church has done since his death and resurrection in Pentecost. So my hope is that people can continue to have a passion for theology, a passion for the liturgy, a passion for the mission of the church, because it's the greatest work you can do. And it has its struggles. And I certainly talked about those in my memoir, but boy, at the end of the day, it's the greatest joy that there is. And the joy of telling people about Jesus. I always tell students the greatest joy I have, and it's one of the most, it's filled with pathos, is taking the body of Christ and saying to them, this is the body of Christ given for you. This cup is shed for you. The blood of Christ shed for you. This is the greatest thing you can do. And I hope that we continue to recognize in our church and in our seminaries that there is no more vital life than the life that we have around Christ in word and sacrament.
Make the case then that since Lutheran confessional theology is sacramental and incarnational, focused on that real presence of Christ, that we simply cannot train pastors like American evangelicals do.
Well, I think that's one of the things that we've been fighting during my time for 42 years, is that everybody wants to go to a type of evangelicalism. It's a disembodied faith because they don't believe that the finite is capable of the infinite. They have a different Christology. And in some ways, therefore, they have a different Jesus. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't believe in Jesus and they're going to be saved, but they don't have. And this goes back to the scriptures. And this is the great thing about the Lutheran confessions, is that they doubled down on Chalcedonian Christology and classic sacramentology, and in many ways clarified it and made it even better because they understood that it had fallen into some misunderstandings here and there. And union with the flesh of Jesus, there is nothing greater than that. And again, I will say what I say to all my students in almost every class. The reason you're going to be a pastor, the number one thing you're going to do as a pastor, is you're going to bring people into communion with the flesh of Jesus. And that is the greatest foretaste of heaven. American evangelicalism cannot say that. There's, as I said, it's a disembodied Christ. And so it's going to be dependent on their emotions, their feelings. He's not here, and you're not having communion with his flesh. And it's all noetic. It's all in the mind. It's all rational. And there's no, like I like to say, stuff matters. There's no Jesus in the water, Jesus in the word, Jesus in your ear, Jesus in your mouth. It's missing that. This is one of the great gifts that I think Lutherans have, along with others. There's certainly a lot of Christians out there, Catholics, Orthodox, who believe like we do in that respect. But our confessions have a clarity to them. And I certainly learned this among those who are seeking Lutheranism in Spain. They're very interested in the confessions because there's a clarity there. And when they read them, for the first time and they see the context and they know the historical context, and we go, my goodness, this is what I believe. This is what the scriptures say. This is what the Catholic Church should confess.
Dr. Arthur Just is professor of New Testament at Concordia Theological Seminary, Fort Wayne, Indiana. He is seasonal pastor at Grace Lutheran Church in Naples, Florida, author of several books, including his latest, Ever to Emmaus, a Theological Memoir. Find out more about this book on the Talk On Demand archives page at issuesetc.org. Dr. Just, thanks for the book and for the series.
Well, thank you for taking the time to do it. It was a pleasure to write, and it's been a pleasure to talk about it with you.
Dr. Andrew Steinman joins us on the other side of the break. The church is remembering Old Testament matriarch Ruth on this day, July the 16th. We will do so as well. Then Pastor David Haberstock, President-elect of Lutheran Church Canada, will join us to talk about confessional Lutheranism in Canada.
Listen weekday afternoons to Pastor Todd Wilkin and guests on Issues Etc. Issues Etc. is a listener-supported program. Your financial support is vital for the continuation and expansion of this worldwide outreach. Our mailing address, Issues Etc., P.O. Box 83, Collinsville, Illinois, 62234. Box 83, Collinsville, Illinois, 62234. You can also donate at our website, issuesetc.org. Issues Etc. is a production of LPR, Lutheran Public Radio.
The third commandment teaches us to remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. We do this when we hold God's word sacred and gladly hear and learn it. Jesus invites the weak and heavy laden to rest in Him, our true rest, because His yoke is easy and His burden is light. This weekend, rest in Jesus as you hear His word and receive His gifts. If you are in Southern Illinois, you're invited to join Trinity Lutheran Church in Millstadt to rest in the grace of our Savior, Jesus Christ. Learn more at trinitymillstadt.org.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jay Krause, principal at Metro East Lutheran High School in Edwardsville, Illinois. Metro East Lutheran High School engages young adults in a Christ-centered environment, delivering academic excellence and spiritual growth to develop Christian leaders for tomorrow. We provide a Christ-centered alternative to public high schools. We're currently enrolling students for the 2026-2027 school year. Learn more at melhs.org, melhs.org.